glazed look that preceded collapse. But Esperanza was not finished with the psychological portion of her retribution. She retrieved a leather-bound ledger from Edmund Greyfield's study, the same book where he recorded the purchase, sale, and breeding of his human property. Opening it to a random page, she began reading entries aloud in the flat, emotionless tone that plantation owners used when discussing business transactions. April 12th, 1715. Sold boy named Caesar, age 14, to Rutherford Plantation for breeding purposes. £45 sterling. Note: mother became unmanageable after separation. Recommend immediate sale or disposal. She turned the page. June 3rd, 1715. Female named Rebecca died in childbirth. Child survived. Estimated loss, £20 sterling. Note: implement better nutrition program for breeding females to reduce mortality rates. Page after page, she read the clinical documentation of human suffering, families destroyed, children sold, men and women reduced to monetary calculations in a businessman's ledger. Each entry represented someone's life, someone's family, someone's dreams crushed under the weight of systematic exploitation. The psychological torture continued for 2 hours, with Esperanza forcing each man to confront the full scope of his crimes against humanity. She had an extraordinary memory for detail, enhanced by 15 years of careful attention to their conversations. She could recall specific dates, individual names, particular acts of cruelty that each man had committed or ordered. But as the morning sun climbed higher and the temperature in the kitchen approached 120 degrees Fahrenheit, she moved to the next phase of her plan. From the kitchen storage area, she retrieved several long iron rods, tools typically used for stoking the coal furnace and manipulating heavy cookware. She placed these rods directly into the furnace's flames, where they quickly heated to cherry-red temperatures that would cause excruciating burns on contact with human flesh. "Gentlemen," she announced, "you have spent years perfecting techniques for causing pain without causing immediate death. You have learned how to torture people for maximum effect while keeping them alive and functional. Today, I will demonstrate that your students have been paying attention." She withdrew the first iron rod from the furnace. The metal glowed like a piece of captured sunlight, radiating heat that could be felt from several feet away. Moving to Edmund Greyfield, she held the rod close enough to his face that he could feel the intense heat without making contact. "This is for every slave you have branded like cattle," she said calmly. "This is for every human being you have marked as your property." What happened next was too brutal to describe in detail, but the screams that echoed through the Greyfield estate kitchen could be heard by slaves working in fields nearly a quarter-mile away. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard before. The desperate, agonized cries of men who had never experienced genuine helplessness and were discovering what their victims had endured for decades. Esperanza worked methodically, applying the heated iron to each man in turn, targeting non-fatal areas that would cause maximum pain while ensuring that her victims remained conscious and aware. She had learned from observing their own torture techniques, understanding exactly how much damage the human body could sustain while still maintaining the capacity for suffering. Between applications of the heated iron, she continued her psychological assault, describing in detail how each man's plantation would be inherited by relatives who might or might not continue their cruel practices. She talked about their children, wondering aloud whether the next generation would prove as evil as their fathers, or might develop some capacity for human compassion. "Your son, William," she said to Marcus Sutton as he writhed in agony. "He is only 16 years old. Maybe there is still time for him to become a better man than his father. Maybe when he learns what happened to you, he will decide that treating people as property is too dangerous." The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical torture. These men had built their entire identity around the belief that they were superior beings, natural masters, who had the right to control and exploit other human beings. Esperanza was systematically destroying that identity, forcing them to experience themselves as victims, as objects to be manipulated by someone else's will. As the afternoon heat combined with the furnace's radiation to push the kitchen temperature above 130 degrees, several of the men began showing signs of severe heat stroke. Their skin turned red and dry, their breathing became rapid and shallow, and their struggles against the restraints became weaker and more desperate. But Esperanza had planned for this contingency. She had no intention of allowing them to escape through unconsciousness or heat-induced delirium. Using techniques learned from her grandmother, she applied wet cloths to their foreheads and forced small amounts of water into their mouths, keeping them conscious and aware while their bodies slowly cooked in the superheated air. "You must stay awake," she told them. "You must remain alert. Death is a mercy, and you have not earned mercy yet." The torture continued through the hottest part of the afternoon, with Esperanza maintaining the furnace at maximum temperature, while systematically applying heated iron rods to each man's body. She targeted hands, feet, and faces, areas that would cause excruciating pain while remaining visible as permanent reminders of their experience. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire ordeal was not the physical suffering, but the complete reversal of power relationships that it represented. For the first time in their lives, these 14 men were experiencing what their slaves endured every day. The knowledge that another human being had complete control over their bodies, their comfort, their very survival. They were learning what it meant to be property. As evening approached and shadows began falling across the kitchen floor, Esperanza prepared for the final act of her carefully orchestrated revenge. The coal furnace had been burning at maximum temperature for nearly 18 hours, creating a heat level that was literally unbearable for sustained human exposure. She began dragging the semi-conscious men closer to the furnace, positioning them so that the intense heat would slowly cook their bodies while keeping them alive long enough to fully appreciate their fate. It was a technique she had heard Marcus Sutton describe during one of the Rice Council meetings, a method he used for punishing slaves who attempted escape. "This is how you killed Thomas," she told Sutton as she positioned his body within 3 feet of the glowing coals. "Remember Thomas, the young man who tried to run away last summer? You put him in a metal cage in direct sunlight and let him cook slowly over 3 days. He begged for water, he begged for shade, he begged for death. You ignored all his pleas because you wanted other slaves to witness his suffering." One by one, she arranged all 14 men in positions where the furnace's radiant heat would slowly kill them, while leaving them conscious long enough to contemplate their crimes. The psychological impact was as important to her as the physical destruction. She wanted them to understand, with perfect clarity, that they were dying because of choices they had made, actions they had taken, and lives they had destroyed. As the sun set on June 24, 1716, the kitchen of Greyfield estate contained 14 dying men who were experiencing, for the first and last time, what it felt like to be completely powerless in the hands of someone who viewed them as less than human. The screaming had stopped several hours earlier, replaced by the weaker sounds of men whose vocal cords had been damaged by prolonged crying. The kitchen filled with the smell of burning flesh and the sound of labored breathing as 14 of colonial South Carolina's most powerful citizens slowly roasted to death beside the same furnace they had used to prepare meals served by the people they had enslaved. Esperanza sat in her corner, still methodically sharpening kitchen knives, humming the Portuguese lullaby that her mother had sung to her in the village that Portuguese raiders had destroyed 20 years earlier. She was no longer looking at the dying men, but her ears remained alert to their breathing, ensuring that none of them escaped into unconsciousness before experiencing the full measure of justice she had planned. As midnight approached, the last of the Rice Council members finally succumbed to the combination of heat, dehydration, and burns that had been slowly killing them throughout the day. Edmund Greyfield was the final survivor, his constitution strengthened by years of rich living and medical care that had never been available to his slaves. His last coherent words, spoken in a whisper barely audible above the sound of burning coal, were a pathetic attempt at bargaining. "Please, I can give you money, freedom, whatever you want. Esperanza looked at him with the same expression of mild interest that he had used when inspecting slaves at the Charleston market. "I want you to die knowing that you were wrong," she replied calmly. "You are not superior. You are not chosen by God. You are not a natural master. You are just a man who chose to be evil, and now you are paying the price for that choice." Those were the last words that Edmund Greyfield heard before the heat and dehydration finally claimed his life. Dawn broke on June 25th, 1716, revealing a scene that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. When the other plantation slaves began their morning routines, they discovered 14 charred corpses arranged in a perfect circle around the massive coal furnace in the Greyfield estate kitchen. The bodies were barely recognizable as human, reduced to blackened shells by 18 hours of exposure to extreme heat. Esperanza de Lima was found sitting calmly at the kitchen table, methodically sharpening carving knives while humming a haunting melody that none of the other slaves recognized. She showed no signs of distress or exhaustion, despite having orchestrated and witnessed one of the most elaborate acts of revenge in colonial American history. When the plantation's white overseers arrived to investigate, they found a scene that defied their understanding of the natural order. 14 of the colony's most powerful men had been killed by a single slave woman who had somehow overpowered them all and subjected them to a form of torture that exceeded anything in their experience. The implications were terrifying. If one slave could accomplish this level of devastation against multiple plantation owners, what might happen if slaves began organizing more sophisticated forms of resistance? The psychological impact on the white colonial population was immediate and profound. For the first time, they began to fear the people they had enslaved. Word of the massacre spread throughout the colony within days, carried by riders who had been dispatched to inform the victims' families and business associates. But the colonial authorities faced a serious dilemma in deciding how to respond to the incident. On one hand, they needed to demonstrate that slave rebellion would be met with swift and brutal retaliation. The entire plantation system depended on maintaining the slaves' belief that resistance was futile and that white dominance was absolute and permanent. On the other hand, they needed to prevent the spread of detailed information about Esperanza's methods and success. If other slaves learned that 14 plantation owners could be killed by a single woman armed only with intelligence, patience, and determination, the results could be catastrophic for the entire colonial economy. Governor Robert Johnson convened an emergency session of the Colonial Council to discuss the crisis. After 3 days of heated debate, they reached a decision that prioritized political stability over public justice. The official records of the Greyfield massacre were sealed by gubernatorial order and locked in the Charleston archives with instructions that they not be opened for 50 years. The families of the victims were informed that their relatives had died in a tragic fire that had consumed the Greyfield estate kitchen during a business meeting. No mention was made of Esperanza's role in their deaths. Esperanza herself presented a more complex problem. Executing her publicly would require explaining her crimes, which would spread exactly the kind of information that the colonial government wanted to suppress. But allowing her to live would send the message that slave rebellion could succeed without consequences. The solution they devised was as cruel as it was politically expedient. Esperanza was sentenced to be sold to a Spanish trader who specialized in supplying slaves to the silver mines of South America, a fate that was universally understood to be a delayed death sentence. The working conditions in the Spanish mines were so brutal that slaves typically survived less than 2 years before succumbing to exhaustion, disease, or accidents. But even this sentence carried risks. If Esperanza managed to survive long enough to share her story with other slaves, she could become a symbol of successful resistance that might inspire additional rebellions. The colonial authorities solved this problem by ensuring that Esperanza would never reach the Spanish mines alive. On July 15, 1716, exactly 3 weeks after the Greyfield massacre, Esperanza de Lima was loaded onto a Spanish trading vessel called the Santa Isabella that was bound for Cartagena. The ship's captain had been secretly instructed to ensure that she did not survive the voyage, but to make her death appear accidental. Isabella departed Charleston Harbor on the evening tide, carrying 43 other slaves along with Esperanza. According to the ship's official log, she died of fever on the 3rd day of the voyage and was buried at sea according to standard maritime practice. But there were rumors. Some of the surviving slaves from the Greyfield estate claimed that Esperanza had spoken of contingency plans, of allies in the Spanish territories who would help her escape if she could survive the ocean voyage. Others whispered that she had been seen speaking with free black sailors in Charleston Harbor, possibly arranging for assistance during the trip. Most significantly, several slaves reported that Esperanza had spent her final weeks at the estate teaching other domestic workers about herbs, about anatomy, about the weaknesses of their masters, and the vulnerabilities of the plantation system. Justice burns slower than coal, she had told them, but burns complete. The fire I started will spread to other kitchens, other plantations, other masters who think they are safe. Whether these rumors contained any truth was impossible to determine. The colonial authorities had moved quickly to disperse the surviving slaves from Greyfield estate, selling them to plantations throughout the region to prevent any coordination of their stories or their activities. But the psychological damage was already done. In the months following the Greyfield massacre, a wave of unrest swept through the slave communities of South Carolina. There were no additional mass killings like Esperanza's methodical execution of the Rice Council members, but plantation owners began reporting an unprecedented series of smaller incidents that suggested coordinated resistance. Kitchen fires destroyed several plantation houses under suspicious circumstances. Valuable livestock died mysteriously after consuming feed that may have been poisoned. White overseers suffered unusual accidents at precisely the moments when they were most vulnerable. Tools and weapons disappeared from storage areas, only to be found days later in locations that suggested slave involvement. Most disturbing to the colonial authorities, slaves began demonstrating knowledge of their owners' personal habits, business arrangements, and family relationships that went far beyond what their duties should have provided. It was as if an intelligence network had developed throughout the plantation system, with information flowing freely between properties that had previously been isolated from each other. The psychological impact on the white colonial population was profound and lasting. Plantation owners who had previously moved through their properties with casual confidence now traveled with armed escorts and avoided predictable routines. The monthly meetings that had been a cornerstone of the Rice Council's coordination were suspended indefinitely, as no one wanted to gather in large groups that might present attractive targets for revenge. Some plantation owners began modifying their treatment of slaves, not out of moral awakening, but from practical fear. If slaves were capable of the kind of sophisticated planning and execution that Esperanza had demonstrated, then maintaining their loyalty through slightly better treatment might be a wise investment in personal security. But other owners moved in the opposite direction, implementing even harsher controls and punishments in an attempt to terrorize their slaves into submission. These plantations experienced higher rates of escape attempts, work slowdowns, and mysterious accidents that suggested their strategies were backfiring. The colonial government responded by implementing new laws that restricted slave movement, prohibited gatherings of more than 3 slaves without white supervision, and mandated harsh penalties for any slave caught with weapons or tools that could be used as weapons. But these laws were difficult to enforce across the scattered plantation system, and they may have actually encouraged more sophisticated forms of resistance by driving slave organization underground. Perhaps most significantly, the story of Esperanza de Lima began circulating through the network of free black communities, underground railroad stations, and sympathetic white abolitionists who were beginning to organize opposition to slavery. Her name became a symbol of resistance that inspired other acts of rebellion throughout the American colonies. Historians would later debate whether the Greyfield Massacre represented an isolated incident of individual revenge, or the beginning of a more systematic form of slave resistance that contributed to the eventual collapse of the plantation system. The sealed colonial records made definitive analysis impossible, but the circumstantial evidence suggested that Esperanza's actions had inspired copycat incidents throughout the South. In 1739, 23 years after the Greyfield Massacre, the Stono Rebellion erupted in South Carolina, the largest slave uprising in colonial American history. While the specific connections to Esperanza's actions could not be proven, some of the rebellion's leaders were slaves who had worked on plantations that were connected to the original Rice Council network. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but it demonstrated that the psychological impact of the Greyfield Massacre had not faded with time. Slaves throughout the region had learned that their masters were not invulnerable, that careful planning could overcome superior numbers and weapons, and that acts of resistance could succeed even against seemingly impossible odds. As the years passed and the American Revolution transformed the political landscape of the colonies, the story of Esperanza Dey Lima became part of the oral tradition that sustained slave communities through their darkest hours. Parents told their children about the woman who had made 14 masters pay for their crimes. Young slaves learned that resistance was possible, that intelligence and patience could be more powerful than physical strength, and that justice might be delayed but would eventually arrive. The sealed records in Charleston's archives remained unopened for exactly 50 years as Governor Johnson had ordered. When they were finally made available to researchers in 1766, the American colonies were in the midst of political upheaval that would lead to independence from Britain. The story of the Greyfield Massacre was overshadowed by larger historical events, but it contributed to a growing awareness that the institution of slavery contained the seeds of its own destruction. By the time the United States Constitution was ratified in 1788, the plantation system, that had seemed so permanent and invincible in 1716, was already showing signs of internal stress that would eventually tear the nation apart. The psychological impact of knowing that slaves could organize, plan, and execute sophisticated acts of resistance had fundamentally changed the relationship between master and slave. The masters were no longer confident in their absolute power. The slaves were no longer convinced of their absolute powerlessness. And in that shift of psychological balance lay the beginning of the end of American slavery. In the years that followed the Greyfield Massacre, whispers of the truth began to emerge from the most unexpected sources. A Spanish ship's clerk, writing in his private journal during a voyage to Cartagena in late 1716, recorded an extraordinary conversation with a Portuguese-speaking woman who had been secretly transferred from the Santa Isabella during a supply stop in Havana. According to the clerk's account, this woman spoke with remarkable intelligence about the plantation system in South Carolina, describing in precise detail the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of individual plantation owners throughout the colony. She claimed to have orchestrated what she called the first lesson, but suggested that it would not be the last. The fire that began in one kitchen, she reportedly told the clerk, will spread to many kitchens. The lessons I learned from watching masters at their evil work are now being taught to new students. Oh, whether this woman was truly Esperanza de Lima could never be confirmed, but colonial records from Spanish Florida began documenting the arrival of unusually well-informed escaped slaves who possessed detailed knowledge of plantation operations throughout the British territories. These refugees seemed to have access to an intelligence network that extended far beyond what individual escapees should have known. More disturbing to the colonial authorities, reports began filtering back from Spanish territories describing communities of former slaves who were actively supporting escape attempts and resistance activities in the British colonies. Letters intercepted by colonial officials contained detailed instructions for identifying sympathetic contacts, avoiding patrol routes, and exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of plantation owners who had grown careless in their confidence. By 1720, Just 4 years after the Greyfield Massacre, the colonial government was forced to acknowledge that slave resistance had evolved beyond individual escape attempts into something approaching organized warfare. Plantation owners throughout South Carolina began reporting coordinated incidents that suggested systematic planning and intelligence gathering. Kitchen fires destroyed several plantation houses under circumstances that defied natural explanation. Valuable livestock died mysteriously after consuming feed that appeared to have been deliberately poisoned. White overseers suffered fatal accidents at moments when they were most isolated and vulnerable. Most unsettling of all, slaves began demonstrating knowledge of their masters' personal habits, business relationships, and family secrets that went far beyond what their assigned duties should have revealed. It was as if an invisible network had developed throughout the plantation system, with information flowing freely between properties that had previously been isolated from each other. The psychological transformation was profound and lasting. Plantation owners who had moved through their properties with casual arrogance now traveled with armed escorts and avoided predictable routines. The monthly gatherings that had been central to the Rice Council's coordination were permanently suspended, as no one wanted to present an attractive target for coordinated revenge. Some masters began modifying their treatment of slaves, not from moral awakening, but from practical terror. If their human property was capable of the sophisticated planning and execution that had destroyed the Rice Council, then maintaining loyalty through slightly better conditions might be a wise investment in personal survival. But other plantation owners responded with increased brutality. The colonial government imposed new laws restricting slave movement, prohibiting gatherings, and mandating severe penalties for any slave found with potential weapons. But these regulations were difficult to enforce across the scattered plantation system, and they may have actually encouraged more sophisticated forms of underground organization. As the decades passed, the story of Esperanza Dey Lima became woven into the fabric of slave resistance throughout the American colonies. Parents whispered to their children about the woman who had made 14 masters pay for their cruelty. Young slaves learned that their masters were not invulnerable, that careful planning could overcome superior numbers and weapons, and that justice might be delayed but would eventually arrive.